Well, I genuinely just want to say thank you. I consider it a real honor to be invited. I think you probably know this, but this is a really remarkable and uncommon room. Church planners and missionaries are my heroes. And so the joy of being able to be here and being able to connect with you and share with you means a lot to me. And when Jim first asked if I would consider coming and talking around issues of culture and secularism, which is kind of a distinct part of my heart and ministry, I just immediately knew that I just would feel privileged to be among you. And I want to spend as much time as we can talking through some of these things that I think are going to be helpful. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and just some things that are emerging on my heart just in kind of being with you. So my wife and I moved from Seattle, Washington to Smyrna a little over 12 years ago in this process of planting. And we've got 4 kids. I don't know why that's a common pastor number, 4 kids, 16, 13, 10, and 9. So much of the process of that journey for us was bound by the nature of the massive change and translocation that happened in the move. And distinctly, not only did we move from Seattle to Atlanta and really show up in a parachute model of planting, we felt a deep conviction that God was actually asking us to come alone and to trust him in writing this story. And I can tell you that when we showed up, the next 2 years were arguably 2 of the hardest years of my life. And I can't tell you how often I felt like I was failing. How many moments in the process of planting the square had to come face to face with so many realities in myself that I couldn't see. I remember this distinct moment. When we were in Seattle, I had been a youth and college pastor, and we'd seen God do some neat things. Like, it was just, we'd established a community, we'd established a sense of ministry and friendship and reputation. And if you would have asked me prior to planting if my sense of worth came from ministry, or if I was overly attached to those things, I would have said, not really. I mean, I've got my stuff. It's just probably different stuff. And then we planted, and it was just this utter painful realization of oh, that's all of my stuff. And I remember this distinct moment. There's this coffee shop in Smyrna called Rev Coffee that became kind of like the first missional hub I lived in. And I remember this moment just with grief in my heart, just walking around this coffee shop telling Jesus, I've told you my whole life that you are enough for me. And you're not. You plus being known is enough for me. And the minute you pulled away being known, you are not enough. I've lied to you. And it was just this real face-to-face journey with myself. And I remember in those moments, even that distinct moment, just how God met me. And the realization of, as much as he sent me to Atlanta, he sent Atlanta to me. That as much as God had asked and was inviting us into this journey of planting a church, far more than that, he was on a journey of sonship with me. I would still say the single greatest success of our church plant has been everywhere. It has caused me to die. And all of the sin that I was blind to, that only risk wakes up in you. And I just want to encourage you that no matter, there's those who have pastored for a long time in this room, there's those that are actively planting, there's those that are in the process of planting, and everything in between. But I genuinely believe that we have to reclaim sonship, daughterhood. We have to reclaim the pivotal work of the gospel in us. that it is the outflow of intimacy with Jesus, truly, that has authority and effect in the lives of those we love and serve. I genuinely believe that there is a profound loneliness that is just existent in our culture, but it is certainly existent in pastoral life and ministry. And I think because what I've come to find is that true fellowship requires the fellowship of our sinfulness. You know, the classic Dietrich Bonhoeffer vision. It's the fellowship of my sinfulness, not my saintliness. It requires the fellowship of my weakness. It requires the fellowship of my uncertainty. And it requires friendship. And I find that pastors tend to have the least friends of anyone I know. And I remember when I was a little kid, though, and I think this is connected distinctly to being a man, though I think it transfers over for the men and the women in this room. But I remember as a kid, my dad was remarkable, very involved in my life. But I would look at my mom, and she had all these friends. I would look at my dad, and I would think to myself, why doesn't my dad have any friends? And he wasn't a pastor, but he was very involved in church life. But I remember this moment when I was like literally dropping one of my children off at a soccer practice to go pick somebody else up from a different practice to then go back to. And it was just this moment of like, oh, it was me. I was the reason my dad didn't have friends. That season of life you get into, right? We know this. The season of life we get into, and I find this distinctly in the heart of men, where you're in the midst of what you're contending for, you're in the midst of what you feel awakening to who you really are and your calling, especially in pastoral life, and it requires grind. Good Lord, planting a church requires grind. And then you just, if you're married, and have children, there's distinctly the part of your kiddos, there's a unique complexity to that. And next thing you know, every ounce of time in life you have is just suffocated out. And part of what I love about the spirit of this room, and you can feel it, is I know I don't have to name for you how many rooms of pastors you walk in and immediately you feel sized up, or the desire to size up. You feel this pressure of, do I fit and belong? How big is my church? Where am I at? How can I? And this sudden sense, which is genuinely a work of the yeast of the Pharisee, and also demonic attacks, and also our just profound sinfulness. There is just no true fellowship in the desire to prove my worth to anyone. And yet it is the most common trait among pastors. And I just want to encourage you that I really believe one of the single greatest things that we have to contend for as ministry leaders is true friendship, is real friendship. And there will be no friendship without weakness. And there will be no friendship without confession and honesty. And I think for us, part of the reason even I really believe this matters is because even in the expression of the beauty of this room, coming in as somebody who comes from a charismatic and Wesleyan background, and just the honor that you would even, I know there is diverse expression in this room, but just even that statement alone speaks the diversity of culture, race, gender that's here. It's real. There's false and fake versions of it all around us. And yet there's the substance of something real. And I believe that this matters because of the principles that we believe in. The multicultural, multi-ethnic kingdom of God, there's something there, that the power of what Paul speaks about in Ephesians 2, that this unified man, that Jesus really has caused this crashing down of the dividing walls of humanity, and what is first placed in the picture between the Messianic community and the Gentile community, that somehow in a radical unity of differences in the person of Jesus, there is power that doesn't exist without it. I believe that. We believe that. That's why we contend to fight for these spaces. But I've learned that the only way to it going from an outer desire or expression to a substantive reality in our life, friendship. Friendship. I believe the greatest work of unity in the church would happen when pastors become friends with other pastors, like genuine friends. But it's going to provoke We just sent a couple on Sunday, a painful one. You want to talk about, these were two people on our staff that I loved, married to each other. They're remarkable. Two of the most gifted people. I adore them. They're like kids to me, They came in as teenagers, became on staff, and we walked together, and sending them now to Oklahoma to plant a church. But I told them, and I've said this every church planner I've ever had the chance to connect with, church planting will just wake up every insecurity you've ever thought you had victory over. And I said, you know how sad it is? Yeah, how sad it is. I was telling him that in my first years of church planting, I had to unfollow friends on Instagram because I would see a picture of what was happening in the church, and it would make me feel so defeated. Oh, that's so pathetic, isn't it? That's how I felt. It just is this place of going, oh, you want to know my spiritual maturity when I planted a church? I unfollowed friends on Instagram. I would look at somebody who's leading in my church right now and be like, you're so petty. That's so, just simple jealousy. You got to turn. But yet I was ravaged by it. And it was just this place, because the journey of church planting for me more than anything else, what I've learned about my lack of faith is it's very rarely in the ability of God. It's always actually, is he really as good? Is he really as good? And having to face stories and circumstances and seasons where the invitation of the gospel had to address all of my idolatry, all of my false patterns, all of my hidden desires, and actually confront, do I really believe Jesus? Do I really believe him? And a lot of that is wrapped into what I'll talk about just in a little bit, about the way we're so formed by our secular world, and the way secularism, the great power and the great reason why I think it matters for us to be people who can entangle ourselves in the cultural frameworks of secularism is because it is a hidden presence that shapes. And it shapes us. It shapes us so deeply. And it's just in that heart that I would tell you and remind you of something. You know this. I'm not trying to teach you something. I genuinely recognize that there's not a thing I'm about to say that not every single person in this room would preach. But just to call you to this, that when the ascended Jesus, speaks to the church of Ephesus, which arguably is the mother church at the time, arguably the most apostolic, the most significant. It's really the guiding framework of the early church at that time. You know what he says. He speaks to me and goes, I know your deeds, the way you have tested apostles, false apostles, the way you've held to the truth, the way you've contended. Think about the things he's saying about this church. There is not a person in this room who wouldn't dream of Jesus looking at your church and going, hey, let me tell you what I love about you. You believe me. You contend for the truth. You actually have the wisdom and discernment to test things out, and when they prove to be false, to stand against. There's not a person in this room who wouldn't want what Jesus speaks of this church. And then, of course, he says, yet this I have against you. You have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember the heights from which you have fallen. And then what is his warning, of course? And if you don't repent, I will remove my lampstand from you. What I would hold, and I think we would agree, is the symbolic language of Jesus saying, I will close your church down. I will close you. And the crazy truth that is embedded in that, which is you can get everything right, and if you get first love wrong, he doesn't care. And I don't think we believe that. You can get everything right, and if you get first love wrong, Jesus looks at us and goes, you don't get to represent me. I think the power of it is beyond what we've stopped to consider. That there's something about first love that more accurately portrays Jesus and the gospel than anything else. And I'm a big guy on truth and theology. I believe theology matters. I love that quote by John Tyson. Life is too hard for bad theology. A lot of my life is about contending with the church to be people who are rooted in the truth of Jesus. to no longer allow the formation of a secular world to define our worldview, but to return to a people with a truly Jesus-centered and biblical worldview. But I would say it is this principle, and I've learned this as much as you have. There is nothing that our lives are built to kill more than first love. Everything about the structure of our lives, everything about the complexity of our lives, everything about the spiritual realities of our life, everything about this, there is nothing that is easier to lose. It's hard. And I think there are probably, this is not my teaching, so I won't do this, but I think there are some biblical probably frameworks that define elements of first love. Specifically, fear of God, I think is an inverted secondary reality of first love. But I think the picture is not meant to be overwhelmingly theological. I think it's meant to be a statement, remember? Like, I was a prodigal, so not everybody has the same stories. But man, I can tell you, I cry. So just know that's normal for me. If you're like, that guy cries a lot, it frustrates me more than it frustrates you. Genuinely, if I could change it, I would. I don't like it, but I've come used to it. And anyone who has to stay in our church has to figure out how to get used to it too, sadly. That's why I have other people speak as much as I do. No, joking. But I just couldn't believe Jesus liked me, saw me, like that he would have fellowship with me. I was a mess. I was so lost. I was so filled with shame. I was really deep in sin. And he found me. And all I wanted to do was love him, know him, serve him. I had no thought about church or leadership or platform or, all of it. And as your life grows, so does the maturity and the complexity, and it's a requirement to continue to grow and to lead in those places. It's not saying that those things don't matter, but I just think this is the picture. What was the substance of first love? It was simple. I just wanted to be with him, and I couldn't believe he wanted to be with me. The greatest fight of our life will be to stay there, to have the humility to return there. And I believe, actually, the greatest thing that will keep us there, outside of course, the power and the work of God's faithfulness and his Spirit, is friendship. It's real friendship. Because when I can be weak with my peers, when I can have brotherhood or a sisterhood, in the places of my actual needs, it is those allies that we know, because we preach this all the time, can walk with me into the very presence of Jesus, the beauty of Jesus, the redemption of Jesus, the confessional life with Jesus. I think they're interconnected. I think it's really hard to be a person of first love alone. I think loneliness will ultimately kill the fire of first love. Because it's ultimately like all things in Jesus. It's a work of his Spirit, it's a work of his grace, and it's a work of his power and authority, and not what I bring to the table. I bring a very weak yes to Jesus. That's about all I've ever offered him. And there is that place of going, when we learn how to come back into the fellowship of true life, whether it's about the complexity of our pastoral life, whether it's about the complexity of our personal life, I actually think what we'll find is the fruit of it is a restored intimacy with God. Is a restored intimacy with God. Oh yeah, I could just talk about a lot of those things for a long time. That's not why I was asked to be here. But I do want to just tell you that I really think church planners are remarkable people. And I just honor you. And I love people who want to take risk for Jesus. He's just worth it. He's just worth it. And every single one of us knows that we need more churches. We need to plant more churches, and we want those churches, rightly so, to survive and be sustainable and to plant more churches. There's nothing wrong with having a vision of planting churches with those frameworks of success. But I would say the greatest success you can have is, will you actually let church planting plant the gospel back in you? That is the single greatest thing. I think Jesus is after it more than he's after anything else. And so it's my just deepest encouragement to you is to genuinely allow that process to happen. I think church planting, the power of it is it puts you in a prime place to realize how inadequate you are and how desperately you need Jesus. But now I was talking to Kia earlier. There are some things, while I'm not out of that place by any means, but it looks quite different. Oh, how I missed those first 2 or 3 years. I genuinely. Because we know this. There is an intimacy and a fellowship in desperation, an utter desperation, that when you're not in desperation shifts. And I'm just, my own prayer life back to Jesus is, whether through heart stance or circumstance, please get me back to desperation. Please get me back to desperation. That's the place where I want to live with Jesus. So let's talk about culture for a little bit, shall we? So I want to just encourage you. Again, it's fun to be in a moment like this or a room like this, because I think my assumption would be already some level of a general understanding of this, if not for some of us, like a greater understanding of it. From my own life, remember this moment. I was in Seattle. I was actually packing up for our process to move to Atlanta. And I remember I grabbed this wedding photo of like me and a handful of my friends. And it was me and 4 friends. And 3 of them were in my line. One wasn't, but they were very close friends in my life. And I looked at this photo and my heart just grieved. Because all 4 of these men had walked away from their faith. And these were not just kids that were raised in cultural Christian homes. These were people I was on the mission field with. These were people I was a pastor alongside. These were friends that contended for the way of Jesus with me. And all 4 of them had not only walked away from Jesus, 2 of them distinctly had marked their life by wanting to contend to burn the church and the gospel down. And I remember just in that moment, this radical, like this grief, because I was very interconnected in these stories. And it certainly wasn't exclusive to them. But I remember this feeling of like, there is something here that I can't see. And even the reality of how unique it was that all 4 of these men, their stories of uncertainty or doubt or displacement could not have started in different places. And yet shortly into the journey, it seemed like they walked through the exact same story. And it was like, I just had this sense of going, I don't know what is happening, but there is something behind this. And even it was a couple of years ago, I was teaching on culture and secularism, and I had a young guy come and after my talk. It was really meaningful. Our stories had a lot of similarities, and he was kind, and he kind of said, what kind of started you talking about secularism or issues of culture? I thought for that fraction of when like a bunch of thoughts go through your brain and all of the possible things that I could have said, but I just remember saying to him, because it was true, like I wasn't looking for any of this. I was just looking for my friends. Like what happened? What happened? 42, I'm in that right at that prime age of the great deconstruction generation. And I know that you have those same photos. I don't even, it was 5-6 years ago, I would have to come with an explanation of so many terms. They're just simply ways of life for us now. And I believe that as God kind of woke up in me, I remember the first time I heard Timothy Keller speak on understanding secularism and secular culture. It was just this thing in my own heart begin to realize that there is a story happening that I need to understand. And even so much of what I do now, or in this book Jim referenced, that is that it took me so long to try to actually wrap my mind around these issues. For anyone who's ever tried to read Charles Taylor, I think I actually began to discern maybe a fraction of it my third time through. I mean, I think the first 3 times I used the word meta-narrative in a talk, I still didn't know what it meant. It's just fun. You just use crafty language like that. Nobody's going to push back on it because they don't know what it means either, right? It's like the ultimate tool of impressing people. But it was just this process. And what I have come to see, and I believe I'm not alone in, and I remember even distinctly sitting in a church planting gathering with Tim Keller where he said this on multiple occasions: secularism is the single greatest threat that the church has ever faced. And that reality of the deforming power of our culture, because part of what makes our culture, this secular reality, so powerful is that it's hidden, it's deceptive, and it's formative. And it's far more embedded in me and you than we would want to admit. And when we can see it, though, we not only begin to see all of the pieces of the stories of the lies that we believe, but we automatically begin to find our way through it. I tell the people all the time, when you begin to lean into secularism, you might think you're learning about worldviews or philosophy or these kind of things. You're not really, though. You're actually just learning about the stories of your own life, and it begins to help things in your own life make sense. Because that's the power of secularism. Secular ultimately is a story about the manipulation of our pain and our wounds. And it's the hidden framework. Nancy Pearcey talks about the ghost in the atmosphere that has shaped so many. I believe that it is distinctly connected to the greatest pain points we face as a church. I really believe that the greatest crises we experience in the practical nature of what we believe and who we are issues around secularism, issues around sexuality, issues around race and biblical oneness. And the reason I believe that the issues of sexuality and race and biblical oneness are as difficult as they are is because they are the ones that are most impacted by the secular deformation we've experienced. Why? Because they're the places of greatest pain. Secularism is literally manifesting itself on our pain and rewriting stories in the name of it. And I believe that if we could see the cultural blinding, Paul talks about in Colossians, what these beliefs that can take you captive. I think we need to be a people who learn how to see our people set free from the captivity that our culture has placed on them. And I think it starts actually in many ways by letting Jesus start that journey in us. When I really began to understand secularism, the most painful part of it was having to see it in myself. Having to actually understand that, this is one of the frameworks of what happens. Secularism literally reforms us into the belief that visibility is success. It's why you feel better about yourself when Instagram gets a certain portion of likes and gets less. It's why you actually have this sense of comparison so deeply driven. It's also your sinfulness. It's also the enemy, but it's a distinct sinfulness and work of the enemy within a cultural framework that has shaped us so deeply that we have bought into these subtle places of lies that if we were really successful, we would be more visible. And so we articulate our lives and we drive our lives and we shape our lives to try to get into these even more visible places because we're yearning for a meaning that is only found in union. And yet we have allowed the shaping of our lives to convince us that true meaning is going to be found in some form of external visibility that it just isn't. And if you've ever been in moments where you've actually achieved some of the dreams you've had, and I know everybody in this room in different ways has, or you're around even people who have just planted or taken over churches and then they've just experienced what we would consider, in many ways rightfully so, radical terms of success in terms of impact and how many people are being saved and transformed and part of the church or fellowship. You know this. There is not a number that satisfies the evil of it. There's not a number. There's no arrival because it actually has nothing to do with truth. It is literally a framework that is keeping God's shepherds from the only place that defines meaning, which is fellowship with him. That I am meaningful because I was made in his image. I am meaningful because he loves me even as an enemy. And I am meaningful because he has saved me by grace. And now he who once loved me as an enemy, how much more does he love me as a son? My meaning is fully attached. Paul would say, my life is hidden in Christ. And when Christ, whom is my life, appears, my life will appear with. That's a statement of meaning. I believe we can see the Apostle Paul function with such a welcoming towards suffering and the loss of public ministry because he settled his meaning. Visibility had no hold over him. It had no hold to tell him what was important, what was not important, what was meaningful about him, or what was not meaningful about him. And I worry sometimes, I genuinely worry sometimes, framed out of my own heart, that how many of us will see Jesus face to face one day and realize we lived far more to try to impress our friends than we did to yield to the Lordship of Jesus. It grieves me because I think it's so real. I think it's so real and so deceptive. And I want to see more people saved. I would love for my church to grow. And I can tell you there are pure desires in that. I just also have to admit there's really broken ones in there too. And I've learned to become really familiar with the complexity of multiple desires and learning how to just bring them all to Jesus and allow him to sort through those things in my life. And there's a slide that has the Jesus and Secularism course and the You Are Not Alone. I just want to stop here for a second. If you'll go to, I think it's 2 from here. That in, back, it's like the green and white one. It says Jesus and Secular. There we go. I want to tell you, so the book is here, but we created this course called the Jesus and Secularism course. And if you go to that QR code, it'll bring it to you. And I want to just tell you, if you go to purchase the individual course and you use the promo code Never Alone, it makes it free. And I would really love to give this to you. Genuinely, I think it'll be a help. Whether it's a help to you, whether it's like a training model, whether it's something you use. It's been really encouraging to see its impact. And it's 12 chapters in the book. We create 12 30-minute teachings and a small group guide that goes with it. But the point is, how do we help everyday people begin to understand what is happening in our culture, how it impacts them, and how to re-invite them into a true allegiance with Jesus and to just kind of stand in that place. So my heart here is I hate self-promotion. But why do I hate self-promotion? Because I secretly want it, right? Like, let's just be honest. I do. I hate self-promotion. I hate standing in front of people and promoting myself. But the reason I hate it really is because I have a secret desire to be better than. It's real. I'm covenanted to Jesus in this season of my life that I need to be a better person of confession. And so, I can present that as so Christ-like. I hate self-promotion. I hate self-promotion because I secretly want it. So anyways, I don't talk about that a lot for lots of reasons, but I do think this would be a help or a blessing to you, and I want to give it to you for free. I don't have a lot of control over the books, but I have control over this. So the Jesus Secularism course, Never Alone. If you use that in the promo code, it makes it free. And I do think even today, I'm going to just have only a few more minutes to talk about a few concepts with you and where you want to go deeper. I think this will be a great help to you. And there are so many other really profound resources. So Jesus and secularism. I think that we recognize that the church is experiencing and has been experiencing a pretty profound crisis of pain and meaning. And by the way, all these PDF, this is all in a PDF that's going to be given to you. So anything that's back on the screen, you're going to be able to have. And in a different room, I would feel the need to kind of prove my case on that, whether can be proven in lots of ways. I don't feel that. You and I are leading in the midst of it. But when I think about all of the different ways it shows up, just stories of watching friends walk away from Jesus, stories of tension with the church, stories of feeling like a fraud, wanting to be exposed, stories of lingering doubt, stories of the exhaustion produced by constant anxiety, story of fractured faith, broken identities, stories of not knowing how to hold the Bible, the challenges it presents. Like, the reality is that people deeply rooted in Jesus are experiencing a pretty constant sense of uncertainty in who they are and what they believe. It has become far more normal to follow Jesus just a little bit uncertain than not. And the reality for us, I think, as we process through this, is that what we're going to come to find is that our crisis, I think it has a name, it has a substance, it has a source. And its name is secularism. the conflicts people feel and we feel around truth, authority, the Bible, sexuality, salvation, church, community, heaven, hell, the list could go on and on. There's a common denominator. And the denominator is simply the framework in which we see the world. And because we have such a kind of a limited understanding of the way belief systems work and frameworks around belief systems work and the way our own belief system functions, that we've minimized it. And I think even as pastors and as leaders, we've minimized it. And we treat secular ideals or secularism in this category that we would treat other things. There's Buddhism, there's Hinduism, there's Judaism, there's Christianity. You can go down the list of all of the belief systems, and we see them in these kind of like categories. You opt into one, you believe one, you kind of identify with it, and you're shaped by it. But it's actually not exactly how worldviews work. In fact, in a culture, there is always a defining backdrop of belief that which all other belief systems exist within. And because we don't understand that we follow Jesus in a secular age, that the very backdrop and curtain of the culture in which we believe in Jesus is a secular culture, means that secularism is at all times functioning as a magnet for all peoples and all belief systems within the culture that we live. So the truth is in that inability to understand the way we're formed, and the inability to understand the way culture shapes us, we've actually not lived actively resistant to it. And not living actively resistant to it, we've been far more shaped by it. Right? I grew up in the 80s when what secular meant was that it was not Christian, right? And of course, the classic, this is part of the challenge, secularism. These are words that have had varied definitions over time, and people even mean them in different ways. I'll give you what I believe to be the most trustworthy definition in a minute. But for me, all it meant was that there was a world out there we didn't associate with, right? I love my mom and my dad. I'm really lucky. My parents are remarkable people. But I think this was just so embedded in the nature of the church, right? It was just like, well, let me tell you, as long as you don't listen to any secular music, as long as you do not watch the Smurfs ever, as long as you don't put your hands on Harry Potter, there's this disassociation. There is stuff out there that we are not part of. And we're going to build this wall between us and that. And then you are going to just follow Jesus for the rest of your life because we've built this protective wall. And let me not mock the heart. As moms and dads, we stand as gates and fences protecting our children. There's a rightful posture in it. And that's what grieves me about it, because I think so many people did it out of a purity of heart. The problem is it doesn't work. It actually is not how formation happens. There was no secularism way out there. It was the atmosphere of everywhere. It was seeping like a ghost into the atmosphere, into my home, shaping me in ways I didn't realize. And actually, what I needed was not to be protected from a secular world. I needed to be taught how to follow Jesus in the midst of a secular world, because that was the world I lived in, and that was the world I was going to have to learn how to govern my own life in the midst of. I tell this to my own church all the time. It's true. I didn't plant my church for them. I planted it for my kids, because I just recognized that we're in this transitional season of life where I could probably spend all of my life and most of my ministry not having to actually address the deepest layers. And I could live in whatever external gifts and try to build whatever thing that I could. But you know who will never have that right? Who will never have that reality? My children. My children will always have to follow Jesus with the severity of the cultural issues that they're facing. And it was my conviction not only that they would experience it within a church, but they would be able to say, I watched my dad walk through this. I watched my dad address these issues. I can recognize these stories, because we have to understand the formation of the secular world is simply at its beginning. That doesn't mean I'm not a person of hope. I have more hope now in my life than I ever have. I can just tell you what my hope is. It's revival, period. Which I just want to encourage and remind all of us in this room is not bound to any framework or fraction of the church. The historic church, all factions of it, has had one common hope outside of the return of Jesus: that God would do a sovereign work of revival in our day. So my hope is real. My hope is loud. My hope navigates my life, but my hope is what it is. It is in no president that can fix things. It's in no cultural framework that can change things. It is in only the spiritual work of the God who loves and rescues and saves. They would have mercy on us. Habakkuk 3:2 is the cry of my heart. Lord, we've heard of your fame. We've heard of your deeds. Renew them in our day. In wrath, remember mercy. That heartbeat that goes, we're in those moments. And if we don't learn to walk through them, I believe that we'll not only not be able to address the actual crisis and pain points that are happening in people's lives, I don't think we'll establish the next generation of followers of Jesus in the way we could. And I long for that. And for a minute, let me just, before I kind of lean into just some thoughts I have around just naming what I see secularism to be, bringing common language, common definition to it. I think the power actually, and I say this to you because my encouragement to you, where there would be some stirring in your own heart, is that actually I believe the greatest exposure of secularism comes through the word. And it is as a people who can stand in the authority of Scripture and find these moments. This is the power, like the power. I mean, I've always theologically believed this. I think in this last season of my life, I've come into a returned innocence of belief of it, that God really breathed this Spirit only into two things, like humans and his word. And then the nature of the authority of Scripture is so dynamic and authoritative and filled with life. It can even address the most radical problems 2,000 years later that a biblical concept or biblical cultural ideals had no understanding of. And yet it's as if it's holding up an exact mirror to my story. Our greatest tool in contending for the truth of Jesus in the midst of a secular world is just by poking holes in the framework of the lie with the one authority we've been given, which is the word of God. There really is something to be said about a sword that's been placed in your hand. And I think there, I want to invite you into something I've seen, but I want to even invite you into the concept behind it, which is that the single greatest tool we have in helping expose and walk in life through these secular stories with the people that we love is through the word. I think there's lots of passages I could walk through with you that do this, but to me, the most significant is Matthew 16, Luke 9, Mark 8, all the same story. It's the story of when Jesus sits with his disciples in Caesarea Philippi and asks the question, who do people say that I am? And of course, then asks the question, but what about you? I think this chapter is so significant. There's a reason Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of them, actually structure their gospels based on this story. All of Matthew 1 through 16 leads up to this story, and all leads after. All of Luke 1 to 9, 9 is the curve, right? Mark 1, same thing. Because part of the heart of what they're doing is saying, if you were to read this for the first time and you finish the gospel, what are they making the invitation? You have to then, at the end of the gospel, go right back to Mark 8, Luke 9, Matthew 16, and as if you are no longer a reader, but a participant, with Jesus saying, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And I have come to learn this is the single greatest question in the history of humanity. This is the single most important question any human being can wrestle through. All other questions must respond to this question. We want so many things in our world and our framework to bring understanding into there. It is impossible to settle anything until we settle this one. Who do you say that I am? But the story has a little more shape to it. So it begins with Jesus doing the second of his miraculous feedings, feeding of 4,000. Afterwards, he gets into this confrontation with the Pharisees. They demand a sign. One of the passages says, Jesus says, no sign will be given to you, you wicked and adulterous generation. By the way, I would love to say that to someone. I've asked the Lord once if there was ever a moment where I could say it and it was true and my heart was right about saying it. I doubt that will ever be true. He had the purity and the authority to say such things, but it's pretty awesome when Jesus just does radical things. That's what he says, you adulterous and wicked generation. But in another passage he says, but one sign will be given to you, the sign of Jonah. Of course, this prophetic imagery of Jonah going to the whale, emerging. And it's crazy when you think about what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. He's saying, I will give you no sign other than this. I will die for you. I will raise from the dead for you. And I'll offer repentance if you're willing. He's so great. He's so great, right? He gets into the boat and he stands in the boat and he says this phrase, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. The disciples immediately don't understand Jesus. It says that they begin to talk among themselves about how they forgot to bring bread. And they're worried that Jesus is upset with them. It's where you slow down and you're like, oh, fellas, he like literally multiplied bread just a second ago. Like how quickly, and you kind of have this like sense of laughing about their plight. And then you're like, oh, Jesus, I'm so sorry. This is what a story to be human. How easy we forget the provision of Jesus, right? But there's a distinct even piece of that because it's part of what Jesus leans into. He says, do you really not see? Do you really not understand? And then there's this beautifully rabbinical thing. It's a little confusing to us. It's very Jewish in its nature. But then he tells them, right, he connects to how many baskets were left over 12 and how many baskets were left over 7. He's connecting these pictures. But I've read this passage a lot in my life. And honestly, I didn't really ever see it or know it or felt like I could understand it. I never actually felt like it felt very momentary to the disciples. I would say there's probably no passage in my recent life that has helped me understand the world I live in. And there's a warning of Jesus here we have to reclaim. Because what Jesus is doing in this moment, he gets into this boat with his disciples and he gives them this warning. And yet immediately, what do? They go to natural things. They go to their bread. They go to their stories. They go to the religious community. And Jesus is going, are you serious? Do you really think life is about going from this location to that location? Life is about bread and boats and this religious community. Like, do you really think this is how simple your life is? Like, and I just think about this for us pastors, how easy we get into the modes of life. It's from this service to that service. We all know the reality of how much Sunday is coming every week. The reality of our stories, how we go from this story to that story, this meeting to that meeting, that family that left and that family that came and all the things in between. We get sucked into the same trap so easily. And what Jesus is actually doing, he's saying there is this spiritual framework to life. Do you not understand that to your left stands this yeast of Herod, this spirit of culture, the spirit of the age that is both a belief system all the way to a demonic reality and everything between? And to your right is this yeast of the Pharisee or the spirit of religion and self-righteousness that is a belief and a framework to a demonic reality and everything in between. And if you do not anchor your life on me and me alone, by default, you will respond to one or both of these yeasts. Paul says twice, and a little bit of yeast will work its way through the entire dough. Like, I really believe part of what Jesus is doing is actually establishing this framework in this very rabbinical way of 12s and 7s and symbolism. He's looking at his disciples and he's saying, if you do not build your anchor of life on me and on me alone, not even by choice, you will default to one of these powers. Beware the yeast of Herod. Beware the yeast of the Pharisee. And part of what we have to see and discern what Jesus is talking about is this truth. That we are people who are called to build this radical foundation of our allegiance on him. And it actually doesn't take often what we think it takes to shift us from that radical allegiance. It just takes a little bit of yeast. Because life is not as simple as the natural things. Part of the framework of secularism has made us as deeply spiritual people as we are, under spiritual people. It's amazing how much the greatest fear of modern pastors and Christians is not to be overly spiritual. And I get it. There are frameworks of that, or there are just really terrible concepts we've seen. And yeah, there's a lot of broken frameworks of that. So there's a form of legitimacy, but what we cannot see is how much we ourselves have been, what under spiritual, over spiritual. Like my life, the spiritual stories of my life are the true stories. But like my life is embedded in a spiritual reality, not the other way around. That is this idea that somehow the natural and the supernatural are these, by the way, even the word supernatural only exists because we're secular. It's an idea that what's out there is actually other and different than what's right here. It's saying that what's right here is my real reality, but then there's something else. Nobody thought that before the Enlightenment. Like even the common phrase, think about how normal it is to walk into a Sunday morning and we ourselves or people in our church community, what do they say? How was worship? Especially for those of us that live in modern worship. How was worship? It's not only like an immature question, it's just secular from the very beginning. As if worship had value based on my experience of it. Like if worship is fundamentally bringing honor and praise and a gift, ministry unto the Lord, I think he's the only person who gets to determine how was worship. And if I actually believe that somehow about my experience has a determiner on how was worship, it's so embedded in the secularism of our lives. We can't even see it. We can't even see it. Because what secularism produces is that we trust the experience and emotion of our stories more than we trust the authority of God. These things they start as yeasts. And if I had more time, I would walk through this more, but just to tell you, I really believe that the yeast of Herod is the spirit of our age. It's the spirit of culture. And for us, that presents itself in its modern form, which is secularism. The yeast of the Pharisee is the spirit of religion that we know very well. And let me encourage you to not overly demonize Pharisees. The great power of overly demonizing Pharisees is then you'll never see yourself as one. And our people will have a hard time. Pharisees were wonderful, actually. I mean, as far as humans go. Many of them followed Jesus. They cared for the poor. They ran the synagogues. Yes, by the time we get to the time of Jesus, there's a distinct enemy nature, and there are many of the Pharisaical community who have drifted. But how did they get there? Because Pharisees had one simple core belief that the reason the Messiah hadn't come yet was because we had tolerated sin. So what we're going to do to see the Messiah return is separate further and further and further. So what is actually the yeast of the Pharisee? It is buying into the idea that I can self-perform holiness by my own ability to separate from sin and the distinctly sinners. Yeast of the Pharisee runs deep in us. And I just have come, what secularism does is it buys this idea of a myth of neutrality. We see things as inherently neutral. By the way, nothing is inherently neutral. That idea that we can self-define meaning to something is just only a belief system that you can hold. Actually, you'd have to be an atheist to believe it. But as Christians, we mitigate those concepts, but we do this all the time. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of things that we have the ability to engage with and interact with. I'm not somebody who is an advocate at all for abandoning or running away from culture. But I think we have to lay down this foolish, naive concept that we have called the myth of neutrality, because when we actually allow the myth of neutrality to enter into our framework, then we become the people who can determine the meaning of something. And when we determine the meaning of something, we're almost always wrong. That's what the myth of neutrality does, and it allows the yeasts. And I've come to learn this. Herod will always call all forms of religious conviction the way of the Pharisee. And Pharisees will always call all forms of cultural engagement and mercy the way of Herod. And this names so many of the pain points of the dynamic of the church, especially on the most contentious issues, right? What side of Jesus are you going to follow? Love Jesus or truth Jesus? So what's going to define your sexual convictions as a church? The loving side of Jesus or the truthful side of Jesus? What's going to determine you'd name down the list as if love and truth had a way to be separated from one another. Right? These lies that we allow hidden to walk through the door of our minds and our hearts because we can't see the ways we've allowed them in. The great tensions of why we don't believe the gospel, the great tensions of why people wrestle to believe the gospel, isn't actually our inability to respond and to believe it. It's that we already believe another one. We already believe another one. Think about the beautiful picture even put in front of us today, Luke 11. Come to me all who are burdened and weary, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Remarkable. Maybe one of the most stunning teachings of Jesus. But think of the framework he uses. A yoke. Picture of an oxen, a yoke that guides. It's a statement of connectivity and allegiance. You go where the yoke takes you. You want to know what I've learned, I think, is the greatest reality happening in so many believers' life? It is not that they haven't sincerely placed the yoke of Jesus on them. It's that they never understood they had to take the yoke of their other master off. And because secularism runs so deep inside of us, we can't see that we're actually connected to multiple masters being torn apart by the inside out. And that often what appears to start at a similar origin. Because what are the concepts of secularism? Love, tolerance, kindness, mercy, equity. Many, or of which all, in their true understanding, are inherently Christian, because secularism is simply the anti-Christian Christian story. It's the anti-gospel gospel. It is a heart shaped by Christianity that no longer wants to have to resolve its life to God. But it looks for all of the same things the Christian soul does. And so the very nature of it beckons us into another belief system. And I believe so many people, the reason they're walking through existential doubt, crisis, I believe that the greatest reason we're having anxiety at the levels we are, depression at the levels we are, and don't hear me wrong, there are multiple reasons for all of these things. But I think the mass wave of disproportionate reality of them is because this is what secularism does. And it's how it shapes us and how it changes us. And I would just say that the way of the Pharisee is separation, the way of Herod is assimilation. Right? It's always that desire of culture to shape us into its image. But this is the beauty of what Jesus is trying to say, is that his way is unique. And it's the way of incarnation. The incarnation is not just simply the Christmas story. I don't minimize the central place of the exact nature of the incarnation. Incarnation is the mark of the way in the ministry of Jesus. It's the embodiment of how he lives and who he lives. And I think in many ways it's most rightly seen in the Old and New Testament frameworks of being exiles. It's this idea that we are a people of another homeland. And yet, as sons and daughters, we walk and travel among this homeland for the purposes of our real king and kingdom. It's an invitation into a life of incarnation. Yet it's after these pictures, right? The confession, Peter's radical confession. I could teach on this forever. I won't. But I think Matthew 16, again, it just holds all of these consequences. The power of what's happening in Caesarea Philippi, the power of Peter's confession, which, by the way, think about how little Peter knew. His confession is not a confession of perfect theology. It's a confession of allegiance. It's actually more of a statement of, Jesus, I don't know who you are, but whoever you are, I'm in. I'm a person that thinks theology matters and the gospel is the gospel and orthodoxy is what we have to draw lines around and defend at all costs. And I think confession to Jesus is far less about, I know exactly what to confess to you, and more about, you're it. Whoever you are, whatever you are, you're it. And I think there's an invitation even in that picture for us. But then you get to the point where this is where Jesus tells them they're going to suffer and die. He's going to suffer and die. Arguably 2 years. They've been with Jesus since the very first time. They're caught off guard by it. I think we get that. And they also not only cannot believe that this revelation, this is not what they signed up for. This is not the Messiah they believed in. This is not what they thought was going to happen. But they also hear what we miss, is that it's just very normal in the Jewish context that the disciples go the way of their rabbi. The minute Jesus said, I'm going to die, what they immediately heard is, so are you. Like, they're grieving. Peter now is this, I think he was already a leader among the disciples prior to this moment, but certainly after it he is. He takes it upon himself. What does he do? He comes to Jesus and he says, never, Lord. Never. I will never let this happen to you. He rebukes Jesus. The audacity of it. He rebukes Jesus. But I want you to slow down and think about why. He just literally confessed his allegiance to Jesus. I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, but if we see it in a single story, arguably a half an hour earlier. He literally just confessed his allegiance to Jesus to show up to Jesus and go, never. That's because Peter just realized that the kingdom of Jesus was different than the kingdom of Peter. And he ultimately had to answer the exact same question we have to answer. That far more than Peter was a disciple of Jesus, he had spent a lot more years being a disciple of his culture. And now he was at this framing moment where he had to recognize that the way of Jesus and the way of Peter were going two different directions. And ultimately, who was he going to yield to? And so he rebukes Jesus. I think the greatest difference between Peter and us is that we just often don't rebuke Jesus out loud. The substance of never, Lord. So loud in the heart of the church. And what is it? It's the presence of another kingdom. It's the presence of a crossroad of decision making. Who has my allegiance? The problem with the formation of so many Christians is that what they can't see is that other kingdom's there. This is the power of offense. not in human terms or hurting each other, but the power of being offended at Jesus. Because when we get offended at Jesus, when we get offended at the New Testament, when we get offended at the authority of that we see in these places, that spirit of offense, when we read scripture, that is actually the presence of the other kingdom we believe. Offense is the greatest way to understand every place you're secular. And actually, if we would have eyes and ears for it, it would be the very place we could have the greatest transformation when we go, oh, why don't I like that Jesus said that? I can tell you, I don't know exactly the detail, but I can tell you why. Because it's pressing against your other king named Herod. And you have to decide which king and kingdom you believe. Never, Lord. I don't know what Peter thought Jesus was going to say back, but I doubt he expected Jesus to rebuke him the way he did, right? Get behind me, Satan. It's pretty harsh. You don't have in your mind the concerns of God. You have human concerns. Think about, by the way, his human concerns. He didn't want Jesus to die. Outside of the context of the gospel, it's not a bad concern. He didn't want to die. I don't think any of us can blame him for that. He wanted to see Israel set free from a pretty oppressive and evil empire. Would any of us have an argue with that? Those were his human desires. See, this is what we buy into. The moral ethic of our human desires when they're contrary to the kingdom of God. And so we buy into this idea that somehow I have a moral compass God does not. I have a justification for my beliefs that God does not. It grieves me, the hidden arrogance of secularism that would actually lead us to the place, and I've heard it many times, that as if Paul knows not love. As if Peter couldn't understand the complexity of marriage. It's this hidden seed. And I put this in front of you because I believe that this is what we're wrestling through. We are a generation of Peters who, in all of the places Jesus is different than we are, rather than learning how to yield to his lordship and his authority, we have just normalized all of the hidden never lords in our heart. And the painful reality is we have done it just as much as our people. Just as much as our people. And I think if we begin to see the story, it'll change us. So this is where I want to close, and then we're going to only have about 7 more minutes. So here's my talk on secularism. Let me end with telling you about secularism. What do I mean by this word? And again, part of, I think, a grace for even understanding that people use this word in different contexts or different meanings is actually when I stumbled into really understanding secularism, what helped me realize is it's story in motion. Secularism is, in essence, an emancipation story that's in process. It's about the emancipation of humanity from God. And so at different moments and different seasons, to name it distinctly looked a little bit different. And secularism will continue to adjust and change. 15 years from now, it'll have a slightly different dynamic because it has a static set of beliefs that are always set by the conditions of the movement of motion. And so there's a grace in that for us to recognize that this is about understanding a story that's happening and distinctly how it's happening in us. And I love definitions that are not helpful. So here's the right definition of secularism is a worldview of a secular age, right? It literally it tells you nothing. I remember the first time I was looking at a definition of postmodernism, and it was a simple definition, and it just said the rejection of modernism. I'm like, it's so maddening that someone literally who was having such a bad day that they just wanted to make somebody angry, that was the definition. It's just unhelpful. But it's a little more helpful than we think because it tells us 3 things. It tells us that secularism has a series of beliefs that create a worldview that are attached to a distinct moment in time. And to really understand the full extent of secularism, you kind of have to understand all 3. And when it's the environment that it creates together. And I would say if you break it out a little bit, secularism is the cultural beliefs and practices of Western society that reimagines a worldview of all aspects of human life away from a God-informed identity to self-established freedoms as a result of the dawn of a post-Christian and secular age. And in that, the simplest way I would explain it, it's about the transition of what it means to be a human being who once saw their life oriented from God who now sees life oriented from themselves. When I describe secularism, the language I use is the cult of self. It's a reimagination of being a human being, no longer allowing God to be at the center of it, but not just humanity at the center of it, me at the center of it. And I think sometimes it takes a little bit to understand all the complexity of secularism, but it's helpful to kind of see its end result. And I write about these 6 truth claims of secularism, which are actually just an extension of Timothy Keller's 4 ideas of what secular culture believes. But in essence, these are the 6 shaping truths of secularism. You need to be true to yourself. You're free to live however you want, as long as it does no harm. No one has the right to understand or right to say what's right or wrong. Uncertainty is the ultimate expression of sincerity. Your experiences and your emotions are the authorities of your reality. Happiness is the goal. Pain is the enemy. All 6 of these are not true. But I don't think people who believe them are evil. I think they're people like you and me. And I think the challenge is that so many of us, we can reimagine ways of believing these. We just use Christian language. And the narratives we tell ourselves have this way of shaping our lives more than we can ever understand. But they're all answers to questions. How do we find true identity? How do we know what is good? How do we find freedom? Does truth exist? Who can be trusted more in your pain? What is the meaning of life? And when you begin to dive in, begin to pull this to its core, the reason is these 6 shaped belief systems are the conclusion of a secular world to the 6 longings of a secular heart. And there's more I would have talked through, but I have this way of always talking longer than I want to. If you go to the next slide, is that even as those who contend for the gospel, I want to tell you that the greatest place we can contend for the gospel is by bringing language to these things. At the end of the day, the heart of a secular world is trying to answer identity. It's trying to answer goodness. It's trying to answer freedom. It's trying to answer truth. It's trying to answer trust. And most distinctly, it's trying to answer meaning. And they've created secular frameworks. They're providing attempts at answers. They're really terrible answers. Well-intended horrors. But what we contend, while we have to speak the truth and contend for the truth, the greatest resolve and invitation is how the way of Jesus actually answers all of these things. And so we just have to learn how to be a people who contend for the way of Jesus in the midst of this. One last thought. I skipped over so many slides. You're going to be like 90% of my slides didn't show up in our talk. But the challenges of a secular age for us, I want to just end on this last thought. The 5 shifts. This is actually something very early in my season of church planting. It was with John Tyson, who pastors in New York. And he named these 5 shifts, and then it woke something up in me where I spent a lot of time beginning to understand them more. But what secularism does is it deforms. Secularism is a deformation belief system. And it shifts us from faith to doubt. It shifts us from love to insecurity. It shifts us from community to individualism. It shifts us from contributing to consuming and from rest to exhaustion. And I just want to tell you, this is, I believe, what's happening to almost everybody in your community. And it is the subtle formation of a culture, because what secularism has done almost more than anything else is robbed our ability to find our meaning in our belonging to Jesus. And when you can't satisfy your meaning, it doesn't go away. It just looks for substitutes. And the 3 great substitutes where we look for meaning will always be our vocation, our relationships, and our visibility. And so everybody in their search for meaning is now looking to try to answer it in their vocation, looking to answer it in their relationships, and looking to answer it in their visibility. And what it actually does is it creates this place where, because what secularism elevates is our emotions and our experiences. By the way, the concept, this is what's so sad. Let me tell you where be true to yourself ends in everybody's life. Be identified by your greatest trauma. Be enslaved and manipulated by the greatest wound that has ever happened to you. Because what secularism does is it brings you into alignment and belief with your stories, experiences, wounds, and pains, where you believe You believe them more than you believe Jesus. And the very manipulation of those wounds and pains then binds us into places where we cannot believe the nature of the gospel because we've already come into agreement with the lies of our past, the lies of our pain, and the lies of our culture. We get so deformed, we no longer believe in the character and the goodness of God, and we don't know how to hold on to faith in who he is because faith is always about his character. At the end of the day, our faith is that we believe what he's like. This is the substance of even Hebrews. Those who had faith, even though they didn't live to see, it was because the extension of all faith is not that I will materialize somehow in front of me the things that God believe God has promised me. Now, of course, I stand on these promised me through his word. It's that he who promised them is faithful. And so the very nature of our lives as followers of Jesus is about placing our faith on his character. And there is nothing secularism wants to do because it's ultimately the anti-gospel and therefore demonic in every way, is to rob our confidence in the character of God. And that's what's happened to an entire generation. The real question is God really who he says he is? And so for us, it's about being a people who can just, as missionaries, right? If I was going to move, my sister was a missionary in Turkey for a long time. I love Turkey. I love that nation. If I was going to contend and bring the gospel to Turkey, of course, we all know what I would do. The missional understanding of the people I was being sent to, that I would articulate and contextualize the gospel. Not that it would ever be lost from its timeless truth and framework, but that in every way I could articulate who Jesus was to the people I was sent to. It requires the missionary mind. We must recapture that for our own people. There is a culture among us that if we can see it, this is the power. Secularism has no authority, has no power. It's actually a pathetic belief system, but it's hidden. It's deceptive. So its power is not in what it is. It's power that we don't know how it operates. But the minute you see it, actually freedom is really quite easy. Believing Jesus is really quite easy. And my heart for you is that as you contend, as you plant, as you lead, to just capture this picture, because I believe the greatest thing we have is just to continue to point people back that Jesus really is who he says that he is. He's really this good. He's really this faithful. All of the cultural tropes and the straw man arguments about the character of God, they cannot hold to the person of Jesus. And I think there is a revival of the goodness of God, but it'll start with a revival of the fear of God. I want to become somebody who yields to the lordship of Jesus again and again and again. But the only way I'm finding that is I have to find all of the never lords I've allowed in my heart. And so my hope for us is that we'll just be people who keep growing and contending. Yeah. Love you guys very much. Ryan, I tried to get to 15 minutes before 2. I got 10. I'm not sure what the best thing is, whether we want to ask some questions at the table or
we have a few minutes for some Q&A.